Let's get going. Hello and welcome to Philosophy Roulette, where I read and review philosophy papers. Feel free to jump on the live stream and you'll can ask questions and see what's going on. I just did a paper a few minutes ago that was a paper on explanation. And so let's go see if we can find something else to do now. Let's do get to page 2. Try to avoid some do something slightly less sciencey because I had all these signs and grounding things. So let's see if we can find something more on the Hegel bulletin. Not science. History and theory. Let's take a look at this. History of humans. Nope, science. Philosophy of religion. Existential inertia and the Aristotelian proof. Okay. That might be fun. But no science. Journal of Business Ethics. The influence of organizations, tax avoidance practices on consumer behavior, moral reasoning. Wow, complicated things. Business ethics. I just watched a video interview from John Simmons on, I forget the fellow's name, but apparently he was one of the guys who basically invented business ethics. So clinical practice is going to be sciencey again. Journal of Medical Ethics. This is going to be sciencey medicine. But we could click on it, take a look. Medical humanities on an organ donation run. Interesting. Okay, but it was interesting because given the state of the world at the moment, everyone's looking like how do you make philosophy more relevant and how do you get paid to do philosophy. The man invented a whole thing which has now moved out of philosophy departments, but not entirely. This is let's see. Let's look at the fourth command. And so, in some sense, how did he do that? How did he end up creating a whole business for philosophers? Where's that Hegel thing? I wanted to see exactly what was that Hegel. Where was that Hegel? What was that one? I didn't click on it. Do functions explain? Oh, there's a whole thing. I didn't even look. Okay, so let's see. Hegel and the problem of beginning. Let's get my search going. Oh no, okay. All the short ones are just reviews. Alright, Hegel's reception of Aristotelian theology, 16 pages. We can look at that. Let's see what else we got. Reviews, all the reviews. So something to think about is exactly how does philosophy expand into other areas. Oh no, it's not going to be available. So sad. Let's see. Shucks. One of these years I'll have to get like some sort of institutional association. Maybe then I'll be able to read philosophy easily. So yes, identify his ideas with Aristotle's God and the metaphysics. Yeah, why would Hegel say such a thing? Regard his philosophy in line with classical metaphysics? I guess I'll never find out. That's so sad. Let's look at 2020 real fast. Maybe there'll be something here. Review. There's only 6 matches. Okay, so nope. Apparently, Hegel is not known for the shortness of his writing, and nor are Hegel scholars apparently. History and theory. I mean, that AI and ethics, though, that actually is, what is this? Why are there no, will vector kill the ornament? I have absolutely no idea what that could possibly even mean. Oh, is this an art theory? What is this? Let's see. Huh. What the heck? Like, this is talking about using vector art. History and theory of media. Alright, I don't know. A little too far out there for me at the moment. Because I don't know if that, yeah, no, that's not the right paper or something. I don't know what that is. But okay, let's just, oopsie, did I misclick? Critical theory of Jürgen Habermas. Let's take a look at what that is. I'm a little confused by history and theory as a... Yeah, see, this is... Yeah, something's wrong with this. I don't quite understand. Alright, let's take a look at this one then. Existential inertia. Not available. Too bad. International Journal for the Philosophy of Religion. General Business Ethics. See what's forthcoming. If there's anything I want to read here. If my internet works, that is. Yes. Huh. Okay. Persuasive advertising, ethical commitments and credit market regulation, sweatshop structural injustice, and wrong of explanation. Why multinational corporations have positive duties to the global poor. Huh. Effects of spirituality and moral intensity on ethical business decisions. Yeah, alright, so this looks like, whoa, there's a huge number of papers. This is why they're always at the top of the list. They probably have a ton of papers getting written about this. Well, let's just see. Let's see, 1 to 11. It's the shortest, so. Journal of Medical Ethics. Yeah, so these are boom areas in the philosophy. In philosophy, people should be more concerned about them, I guess. So. You look like a young person. Why don't you upload your stuff to Phil Papers? I don't understand that. Not available. Not available. What was that other one? This is. Let's see. Credit market. Let's see if there's like a super short one or not. Review. Let's see. I've got. Yeah, see, I have the question mark search for even shorter papers. But like it looks like nothing. All the shorter papers aren't even. Yeah, they're just corrections. Okay, so. Symposium. Okay, so. No super short things. All right, let's see what exploitation's about and see if that's available. Nope, not available. Credit market regulations. Hope everyone's doing well out there. I can't find a paper to read, and I don't want to read another grounding paper. I keep forgetting to take off that bark. It drives me nuts. Because it comes through, I don't know if you guys can hear it, but it's loud in my headphones. Okay, so nothing's, oh, that's right. So nothing's that short. There we go. Alright, so we've got 1 to 2. How to overcome lockdown. Selective isolation versus contact tracing. So, a 2-page paper. See if it's available. Somehow I don't believe it. 3 pages, let's see. Okay. Well, I like it when it's this short, so we're going to do a super short paper. Woo! Makes me happy. So. Alrighty. And if you want to join along, link is now in the chat. You can always type !paper and the link will pop back up. If you come a little later. So. Okie dokie. So here's what we're going to read now. How to overcome lockdown Selective Isolation versus Contact Tracing in Journal of Medical Ethics, forthcoming paper by Lucie White and Philippe van Basshuysen. I apologize for how I say your names. Good. Alright, beginning. It's a 3-page paper. In light of the COVID-19 pandemic, policies that would normally be considered repugnant are becoming serious options. One such policy is to selectively isolate the elderly due to their increased risk of becoming severely ill from COVID-19, and thus the disproportionate strain they are likely to put on limited healthcare resources. Julian Savulescu and James Cameron, I take it not the movie maker, argue that in order to lift general lockdowns, mandatory isolation of the elderly should be imposed. They contend that isolating the elderly in this way is ethically permissible because it is less coercive than locking down the entire population until herd immunity is achieved or an effective treatment or vaccination is developed. In making their argument for a selective isolation of the elderly, however, Savulescu and Cameron failed to pay adequate attention to other potentially viable alternatives. The ethical legitimacy of a selective isolation policy, according to Savulescu and Cameron, is contingent on the viability of other alternatives, specifically alternatives that can more effectively target proxies for risk of infection or severe illness, and that led to less overall interference with liberty. There is one such potential alternative, an effective contact tracing app. Savulescu and Cameron briefly consider and discard the possibility of a contact tracing app as an alternative to selective isolation, partially because widespread testing will be needed to make sure that the system is not flooded with false positives. They seem to have in mind a centralized system here, in which app users can be identified by the relevant government agency. Under this system, users could immediately report any symptoms on the app, allowing for an immediate temporary quarantine of all those close contacts. In order to identify and correct for inevitable false positives through false alarms or malicious reports must be followed up by testing and contacts brought quickly out of quarantine where reports are established as erroneous. There is evidence to suggest that such a centralized app-based system is the only contact tracing system that allows for rapid enough action to prevent a second lockdown, as opposed to purely manual contact tracing or a decentralized app-based system where public health agencies have no access to the details of the infected, and thus to avoid false positives. Reporting can only take place after a confirmed test, leading to a lag which will result in significantly more infections. Savulescu and Cameron are right to note that the centralized system will only function with a sufficient testing capacity. However, it appears that the selective isolation of the elderly might require an even higher testing capacity, as it will only function effectively if caregivers are frequently tested, as often as daily, with quick testing turnaround. This might thought to be borne out by the situation in Sweden, which focused on limited social contacts of those over 70, but where over 90% of those who died as of May 5th were over 70 years old, 3/4 of which lived in care facilities or received at-home care. In addition, Savulescu and Cameron note that contact tracing apps are unlikely to work when implemented voluntarily. It certainly seems that voluntary uptake will be insufficient to prevent a second lockdown. But as we're considering a mandatory selective lockdown here, perhaps a better point of comparison is a mandatory contact tracing app. Such a possibility has been ruled out by many countries, but how might this compare to a selective isolation policy focused on the elderly? If both options provide an effective means of avoiding a general lockdown, which is to be preferred? Okay, so, there's two very different concepts here. Does the government step in and be like, all right, all you old people, you have to quarantine yourselves? And then the other one is everyone has to mandatorily have some sort of medical testing constantly because the app is always with you. So it's a sort of a medical regulation that we're constantly living under here. And so instead of just giving restricting the freedom of the old folks, we are just inherently changing the liberty of everyone else because you are constantly under some sort of medical inspection. And if the goal is to prevent a complete lockdown where everyone just has their lives unhappily quarantined, then what's actually the better understanding here? What's the actual what's the criterion here? All right, so let's look. Let's look at the three arguments Savulescu and Cameron offer in support of selective isolation of the elderly. First, they suggest that selective isolation is an effective means to prevent another general lockdown with all its associated economic and resulting health consequences. A contact tracing app, as long as it is mandatory or can otherwise achieve sufficiently high uptake and centralized, also has the potential to slow the spread of COVID-19 enough to avoid a second lockdown. Second, they argued that the elderly themselves will benefit from selective isolation because it will reduce their risk of death. As has been noted elsewhere, this paternalistic justification for enforcement isolation should be viewed with extreme suspicion. It is also not clear if this restriction of liberty should be straightforwardly construed as a benefit. Prolonged isolation takes a significant toll on mental health, and Savulescu and Cameron are proposing that selective isolation be implemented until a vaccine or treatment arrives, a process that could take months or even years. It is well established in medical ethics that hard paternalistic justifications for restrictions of liberty or other conduct of comparable significance are not justifiable in cases where the individual retains the ability to decide for himself what constitutes a benefit. Yeah, paternalistic justifications, but this is not just paternalistic justifications because the whole society is like really suffering because of the pandemic. So it's not really paternalistic justifications of restricting liberty. It's society based, and that's not paternalistic. It's a paternalistic solution, but the justification is actually wider than just paternalism. I mean, generally paternalism is bad, but maybe in these really unusual cases, this is not actually as bad as it seems. I don't know. The third justification is that selective isolation, when compared to a general lockdown, will lead to less overall loss of liberty. Yeah, that's kind of the issue here. Although this involves discriminating against a particular group, Savulescu and Cameron that such discrimination is justified when the burden is proportionate. The alternative, they argue, would be to lock down everyone, including the elderly. Could this strategy also justify the selective isolation of other groups that show an increased propensity for severe side effects, like ethnic minorities or men? Savulescu and Cameron contend that such measures are less justifiable because the negative effects would be proportionally greater, and the proxy here is not as good. Elsewhere, they contend if there were a better, more accurate proxy, then to continue to discriminate would be unjust. Age, they further claim, is the best available proxy for the likelihood of serious illness, leading ultimately and cumulatively to an overburdened healthcare system, and thus the need for a second lockdown. But as Savulescu and Cameron note, only 18.4% of those over 80 who contract the disease must be hospitalized. The proportion of 70 to 79-year-olds is 16.6%. The proposed strategy involves locking many people down who will not pose indirect harm to others through consumption of limited resources. So age is not a great proxy, but is it the best available proxy? No. An effective contact tracing app could achieve the same ultimate goal by targeting and quarantining those who are most likely to pose a direct risk of harm to others, those who have been exposed to the virus. This also has the advantage of not using ground membership as the target factor, not using group membership as the target factor, which carries clear risk of exacerbating existing group disadvantages or stigma. Rather, it relies on the individual movements of every person. Of course, there will also be collateral damage with this strategy where false positives result in erroneous lockdowns. But in a centralized system where individuals who report symptoms can be followed up and tested, such erroneous lockdowns can be quickly reversed. Thus, individuals who do not pose a threat to others will only be quarantined for short periods of time compared to the indefinite, perhaps years-long lockdown of the elderly. Looking at these sort of numbers, I'm not sure, granted, this was written, as you saw earlier, months ago. Anything that has gone to publication in terms of COVID-19 is going to be out of date very quickly. So nowadays it looks like comorbidities are really what it is. It's that you die if you have other underlying conditions, which most people have some conditions, and if we actually had some idea what those were, maybe those people have to take further restrictions. Maybe that's good, but it seems like everyone gets it. So the question is, how enforceable is the app? I really don't know how enforceable it is to get everyone, because it's sort of like, first of all, I got my finger up, like, counting off the issues here. So if we're going to start, what actually would be the sort of, like, what sort of group, how do we target the groups? Like, what is the proxy here? Now, of course, it's always the poor people that suffer the most because they have generally the worst health care out of anyone, so they already have more comorbidities. They may not have access to the technology, so we'd have to, like, guarantee that everyone has access to, like, a phone or whatever the contact tracing app is, that those phones work, and those poor people always have more burden because they have to work, because otherwise they're going to starve or get thrown out of their house. Whereas people with more money, they have more of a cushion to fall back on. So all of a sudden you're putting the burden, instead of being on old people, you're putting the burden on basically poor people. Now, is that really how we want to go about this? So I fear that, like, this sort of thing, it's like, yeah, this is looking at it from a sort of a rather classist, like, that the proxy here, it's that it's also missing other factors here. So just because we don't want to just overburden old people, because apparently that's not it. And, like, these numbers, even though this is probably from a few months ago, these numbers actually show you that they know it's not the age. It's usually they had an idea it's not the age, and that's not surprising. It's like people who are in, like, very good health, they don't die, or at least they only die at a very small rate. But the problem is, this sort of contact tracing app assumes a lot about the population. At least here in America, a lot of the population is not doing so well at the moment, and so putting extra burden on the people who are already poor and suffering is going to be sort of maybe disproportionately burdensome for them, as opposed to, like, going to all the old people. Now you're abusing the poor people. So that this is sort of what I'm a little worried about here. I mean, it's like, yeah, if everyone has a nice phone and it's not intrusive, you just put an app on it and it gives you an alert, hey, go get a test, and then, like, you go get a test in a few hours, and, like, then it comes back the next day, and, like, you're okay, fine, like, I hung out for a day or two, that's cool. I don't think that's the option for a lot of people. I mean, we can't even get people a day off to go vote in this country, which is, like, our right as Americans, as U.S. citizens. We can't even get that. People have to work and they can't go vote, and this is basically a voter suppression tactic, that you can't go vote and you can't vote by mail because they know that if you're at work and then you have to wait to get off work, then you're going to miss the voting window, and there's going to be a huge line as soon as everyone gets out of work. So it's the same thing. Is that it works under the assumption that you can afford to take the time off for this, but you are then burdening those people who can't afford to do it. Okay. So, here we go. Continuing. The individual-centered nature of this strategy produces its own disadvantages. Maybe they'll mention this. Yeah, see, I wonder about this. Like, transferring the, from centralized to individual. I mean, a lot of times we sort of like this idea in, at least the American society, as an individual-centered society, but really it's a punting responsibility a lot of times, and this is what worries me. Under the centralized contact tracing app that we are advocating, information is collected about whom individuals have been in contact with, which could be abused by authorities and is vulnerable to hacking attacks. Yeah, this happens all the time. We should not discount that. These things are completely insecure, and it gets abused. It is for this reason that Apple and Google have made it very difficult to develop a functioning app that stores any information in a centralized manner. This is certainly a serious problem, and it is an open question whether servers can be made sufficiently secure. They can't. That's just not even going to happen. And whether potential abuse can be mitigated with adequate legislation, it's going to take too long. We can barely do this now. However, due to the unpalatability of alternative options, including the extended isolation of certain segments of society, this mitigation strategy deserves more serious consideration. As Savulescu and Cameron note, no strategy is without its downsides. Okay, so that's it. Sure. So the question is, again, how are we choosing who is going to, like, suffer, basically, for the greater good here? And the Savulescu and Cameron are saying you just do the most obvious populations or groups that are going to die and let everyone else just sort of weather out the disease. And then the author here is saying, the authors, I guess, we should place the burden onto people as opposed to being centralized. We should transfer that responsibility to the people in an app that would enable everyone to sort of have individualized care. Now, yeah. So the question is, how well could we centralize things versus how well can we distribute the responsibility? This is like an ancient question. We've been trying to grapple with this one for a while. I mean, is it deontological? Do you just have a sort of like a command structure? It's like you look at this from like, this is the rule, this is what how everyone should act this way in sort of deontology, or are you trying to figure out individually what acts sort of will create the most happiness? How do we actually distribute that to each area and let everyone sort of calculate their happiness? And that's kind of what the app is doing. It's sort of picking and choosing each of the like hotspots and trying to shut them down to keep the overall happiness better, versus the sort of, let's just like separate out sections of the population that are going to be the most burdensome and cause the most problems. So these sorts of distributed issues versus centralized issues, this goes back to fundamental questions on how to do ethics. Yeah. My concern, as I mentioned, is by the individual-centered nature of this strategy produces its own disadvantages. I agree. The security implications are terrible. It is guaranteed to be abused. It's like just guaranteed to be abused. This is the nature of how Apple and Google make their money at the moment. Like Facebook too, for that matter, is that they know who you are in contact with. They know where you are. They know all about this stuff. Same with credit card companies and like the things, but then they show you advertisements based on your shopping habits and location, and then the advertisers give them money because you spend your money there. And so if they were to know all these things about who you're in contact with and what you're doing, then they would have way more, then they would be getting huge benefit in knowing how to sell you goods and make money off that. This is like the literal definition of the current economy. It's a surveillance economy. And how we make money. It's like how Amazon does it, Apple, Google, and everybody. And there's a current fight actually between Apple, who makes more money not advertising but on hardware sales, on premium. You pay a little bit more for the Apple hardware, but then they say, well, we don't track you, versus everyone else, like Google and Facebook, and they're currently in a bit of a battle about who gets if Apple like blocks off some of the advertising. But these are the most valuable companies in the entire world now, because they have effectively found ways to monetize this information more than everyone else. So if they all of a sudden have the ability, or if the government or someone else now has this information, then first of all, Apple and Google and Facebook will lose their monopoly, which they don't want. And then who's going to get it? It will be somebody else, and that's going to be abused even more. So then we're just going to have a lot of factions abusing the population. So this worries me. It's like, now the question is, do we just get to pick and choose, like old folks or whatever, kids don't get to go outside anymore? I mean, that's terrible in its own way. But, I mean, I fear about this thing is that we just don't understand the technological implications and who is getting burdened here. I really, that does concern me. Like I said, the poor folks, like if you don't have the ability, if you don't have a fancy phone and then you have to run an app on it, maybe you don't have a good enough phone to do that, and then all of a sudden you're being told you have to get a phone, you have to put this app on it. Like, who's going to buy them a phone that can do that? Like, really? So, like, and then you have to go for testing all the time. It's like, well, some people can't take off from work. They're just going to lie. What's it called? There was just a funny article. I mean, this is not new, but was the location-based delivery services. I mean, it's like the Ubers of the world, the apps for delivery services and taxi services. People were they were hanging their phones in trees, or a phone in a tree, to basically, I didn't even read it because I know what's happening. They're spoofing their location. They're faking that they're in a location, on a high value location, so that they get called for more rides. And so they're faking their location. This is exactly what's going to happen. Someone is going to put their phone in a certain safe location so that they never get called for testing, because their phone never goes in contact with somebody that would be potentially sick. So the question is, who is going to be most burdened here, and will it be effective? Now, clearly, just picking out all the old people, that's not going to work, because as the numbers are showing, that's not it. The comorbidities, again, are the biggest issue, but then that, again, is pushing it onto the responsibility onto the individual, and there's the question of how does that work. So, I mean, my complaints aside, this is a nice short article. It shows that if you just push one side of this discussion, the other side is going to have a response. These are sort of like, this is always a debate here. So, I mean, even though 90% of those have died as of May 5th, you can see this was written months ago. We're over 70 years old, 3/4 of which lived in the care facilities. I mean, yeah, this was all... It doesn't even work to separate out the old people, because they're still... It's almost impossible. So apparently it's not even easy to separate out those people. So there's still problems no matter which way you go. So I think basically this sort of argument shows that we really haven't grasped the political and social sort of responsibilities that we need to have in government and technology to deal with these sorts of things. And this is a good paper. Like, it shows you get one side says one thing, the other side's, well, that does not work at all. And then I'm firing back on both sides at this point, because this is so slow. Like, just getting things to publication in academic journals is so hard. And even though this is well written and is good, it's still months out of date. So, again, nothing against these authors. This was nicely written. No, they understand all of the sort of the problems here. And, but, oh, boy, are we in trouble. Okay, so anyone have any questions out in the audience? I'd love to hear them. But yeah, nice article. Just short and sweet and to the point. And but we're still not through this. All right, I hope everyone has a wonderful day today and stays safe out there, and I will see you soon. Goodbye.